Okay, so chapter 8 is all about imperfect competition. Now, this is monopolies, oligopolies, and monopolistic competition, and you'll see that all three of these things are very similar, yet also very distinct. And the only one of these three market structures that can have persistent long-run economic profit is monopoly. Oligopoly and monopolistic competition tend to get their profits eroded away in the long run due to market forces and competitive forces. But a pure monopoly where there's only one seller has no competition, and therefore they're able to sustain their kind of high prices over the long run. The key concepts or the key things you have to understand in this chapter, first and foremost, is how to calculate marginal revenue for a monopolist. For a perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue is just the price. That's not the case for a monopolist, because a monopolist is so big that when they want to sell more, they have to reduce the price. Where an individual firm, remember, they're price takers. They just, whatever price is, that's the price they want, and they can sell it for however many they want at that price. But a monopolist, if they increase their quantity, they're actually going to have to reduce the price on all of their previously sold units. And so marginal revenue for a monopolist is different than marginal revenue for a perfectly competitive firm. For a perfectly competitive firm, it's just the price. For a monopolist, it's always less than the price. And it turns out when we do this on a graph, the marginal revenue curve is twice the slope of the demand curve. So if the demand curve has a slope of 1, the marginal revenue curve will always have a slope of 2. If the demand curve has a slope of 2, the marginal revenue curve will have a slope of 4. It always is twice the slope or steeper than the demand curve. Another way to remember it is that if the horizontal intercept is, say, 100 for the demand curve, then the horizontal intercept for the marginal revenue curve will be half of that, or 50. And if the horizontal intercept for the demand curve is 80, then the horizontal intercept for the marginal revenue curve will be 40. So the first thing is, how do you calculate marginal revenue for a monopolist or for an imperfectly competitive firm? The second key concept to understand is, where does a monopolist maximize profits? It turns out it's the same rule as for a competitive firm. They're going to go where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But remember, marginal revenue is different for a monopolist. So it turns out that the profit maximizing quantity for a competitive firm is always going to be slightly larger than that for a monopolist. And so you have to understand those graphs, similar to the ones we learned in chapter 6. They're going to come back into play here. But what you're going to have to see is sort of how a monopolist, where they maximize their profit relative to where a competitive firm would maximize their profit. And it's different. And so the second kind of bit, so the first thing is, what's the marginal revenue? How do we figure it out for a monopolist? The second thing is, what's a monopolist profit maximizing price and quantity? And then the last thing we want to understand is, how do monopolies impact the market? Is there any loss in economic rent? Is there any loss in sort of efficiency as we measure through economic surplus? And remember, that's producer and consumer surplus. And so we'll see at the end of the chapter sort of how monopolists can use pricing to kind of capture more consumer surplus, and also how monopolists sort of take away efficiency in the form of deadweight loss. Okay, so that's sort of the key concepts to understand. You will have to be, you will want to learn how to calculate the value of the deadweight loss and sort of what the value of the lost efficiency is from a monopolist. That's something that's going to come up on the homework and probably on the final as well.